بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. This is lesson 10 in our reading of al-Risala al-Khushu, and in this lesson we're going to be continuing the discussion that we began in the previous lesson, which concerned attaining purity or presence of heart within the actions and integrals and conditions of the prayer. And so we reached the discussion on standing or qiyam. And so Imam al-Khadimi says, وَالْقِيَامُ اقرأ سورة الناس تحفظا من وسوسة الشيطان. That recite Surah al-Nas in order to preserve yourself from the whisperings of the devil. فَتَأَمَّلْ بَيْنَ يَدَيْ مَنْ تَقُومُ وَتُنَاجِي. And reflect and think about who it is you are standing in front of and who it is you are about to beseech. ويستحي أن تناجي مولاك بقلب غافل وبوساوس دنيا ظاهل وبخبائث شهوات لاهن. And have a sense of shame that you are going to beseech Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and call upon Him with a heart that is heedless and in a state where you are absent-minded due to the waswasa and the whisperings and the thoughts of this dunya and the desires that you have within yourself, which also make you heedless. وَاللَّهُ تَعَالَى مُطَّلِعٌ عَلَى سِرِّكَ وَنَاظِرٌ إِلَى قَلْبِكَ وَإِنَّمَا يَتَقَبَّلُ صَلَاتَكَ عَلى قدر خشوعك وتذللك وتضرعك فاعبده كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is someone who is aware of your innermost states. He looks at your heart and He only accepts that part of your prayer. He only accepts your prayer to the extent that khushu and humility and submission is found in it. And so worship Allah as if you see Him, and if you do not see Him, then know that He sees you. Now, this last part of this paragraph by Imam al-Khadimi is of course a reference to the very famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where Sayyidina Jibreel ﷺ comes to the Prophet and inquires about Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. And when he asked the Prophet ﷺ about Ihsan, the Prophet replies that Ihsan is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you see Him, أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه, and if you do not see Him, then to know that He sees you, right? فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ فَإِنَّهُ يَرَاكَ. Now this hadith is of course one of the pillars of our faith, and it really encapsulates our entire religious tradition. And so over here, when we look at this particular phrasing and how ihsan is being defined, what the ulama take note of is the fact that there are two parts to this definition of ihsan. One is witnessing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to act and engage in worship as if one is witnessing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the Prophet says, if you are not at this particular state, then at least know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ever watchful over what you are doing. And so we'll read here what Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali said about this particular hadith. Ibn Rajab said, some of the Salaf said that whosoever acts for God while witnessing Him is a Gnostic, is an Arif, or someone who knows Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala experientially. And whosoever does so while being aware that God is witnessing him, then this person is a sincere individual or a mukhlis. And so these are two stations, Ibn Rajab says. The first is the station of vigilance or muraqabah. And by first over here, he means that this is the lower of the two stations. And then he describes it. It is for the servant to bring to mind God's closeness to him and His knowledge of Him. So he imagines himself between the hands of God and therefore is aware of God in his movements and state of rest and in private and public. This is the station of the sincere muraqib, and it is the lowest station of ihsan. Now the first thing to note is of course what he mentions at the end over here, that this is the lowest station of ihsan. The lowest station of ihsan is for an individual to have this constant awareness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ever watchful, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of one's actions in secret, in public, in a state of rest, or otherwise. And so it's a very high station. But more importantly, is firstly, if we look at what Ibn Rajab mentions in the first paragraph, he connects the one who has muraqabah with one who has sincerity in his actions. And so over here, the ulama, oftentimes they make this connection. They say that muraqabah is a prerequisite to attain a state of ikhlas with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And muraqabah, in order to actualize and realize this state, the state of being always aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching one, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is someone who is aware of our inner states and our outward actions. In order for us to attain this particular state, we need to have muhasabah. So muhasabah comes before muraqabah, and muraqabah comes before ikhlas. What is muhasabah? Muhasabah means that you are always taking yourself to account. You are vigilant, you observe yourself, you observe your actions, you put your actions under a microscope, and you see when you slip, you turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You notice your slips, you notice your shortcomings, you are constantly engaged in the practice of being vigilant and observant about the actions that you are performing in order to rectify them and correct them, in order to prevent yourself from falling into things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made impermissible or disliked for you. And once you perfect that, once you make that into a habit, once you perform that regularly and constantly, then you reach a level where you attain the state of muraqabah, where you become aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always watching you. And when you are aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always watching you, then you reach this degree of ikhlas, where you actually have true sincerity in your heart for the acts of worship that you are performing. Now over here, one of the things to note is this idea of muraqabah is intimately connected to our understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so Ibn al-Qayyim, rahmatullah alayh, he says, وَالْمُرَاقَبَةُ هِيَ التَّعَبُّدُ بِاسْمِهِ رَقِيب الْحَفِيظ الْعَلِيمُ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, etc. And so whosoever understands these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, understanding what these names represent and what they demand from the individual, then this is when he attains this state of muraqabah, or the station of muraqabah. And so if we are lacking in muraqabah, what this means is we are lacking in understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and recognizing Him. Because if we recognized Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we would know He is Raqib, we would know He is Alim, we would know He is Sami and Basir, right? He is someone who is all hearing and all seeing and all knowing and ever watchful, etc., etc. These are names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are His attributes. And whoever truly understands and recognizes these attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he will act accordingly. And acting accordingly would mean that he understands that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of everything he does. And so he's going to be watchful over his actions, and he's going to try his best to perform those actions with sincerity. He's going to try his best to avoid actions that are impermissible, because he knows Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching over him. And so when we lack muraqabah, we lack knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this is something that helps us fine-tune and refine our connection and our understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and give Him what he is due. Then we have a further discussion on standing. So Imam al-Khadimi continues and he says, فإن لم تقدر على إحضار قلبك فإنما هو من قصور معرفتك بجلال الله تعالى. He says, if you are unable to make your heart present in the prayer, then this is simply due to your lack of understanding of the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the point that we were mentioning earlier, that your lack of presence of heart, your lack of self-vigilance, your lack of muraqabah is a result of a lack of understanding regarding who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. So then Imam al-Khadimi says, فَقَدِّرْ أَنَّ رَجُلًا صَالِحًا يَنظُرُ إِلَيْكَ لِاطِّلَاعِ كَيْفِيَّةِ صَلَاتِكَ فَتَسْكُنُ جوارحك فتجتهد بمراعاة جميع آداب صلاتك فقل لنفسك ألا تستحي من مولاك حيث خشيت الناس ولا تخشاه وهو أحق أن تخشاه. And so he says, imagine for a second that a righteous individual is looking at your prayer. He's observing your prayer in order to see how it is. Then what will happen is, when you imagine this, or when this is actually happening, usually your limbs will become really relaxed, you'll become calm, you'll really strive to ensure that all the adab of your prayer are being fulfilled. And then he says that when you think about this, say to yourself that aren't you ashamed that you can do this for people, you can do this out of fear of the opinion of people, but you are not doing this out of fear for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then ask yourself, who is more worthy of being feared in this regard? People or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And again, he's pointing to a reality that when we are around people, when we're in a congregational setting, then at that point, because people are looking at us, we try to perform our prayers in the best way possible, because we don't want individuals to look at us and say, oh, he doesn't know how to pray, or look how fast he's praying, or why is he praying in this manner? He's not doing his sajda properly, he's not doing his ruku properly, etc., etc. So again, if this is our reaction with people, while when we are alone, only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we sort of fly through our prayers, what does this say about our state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What does this say about our sincerity? What does this say about our recognition of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is when we are fearing creation more than the Creator? ولذلك حين قال أبو هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه كيف الحياء من الله تعالى قال تستحي منه كما تستحي من الرجل الصالح من قومك. And so he reports something from Abu Huraira in this regard as well, something very similar to the example he mentioned, that someone asked Abu Huraira, how should one be sort of ashamed or have shame before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And Abu Huraira says, have shame before him as you would have shame before a righteous man from your community. And this is actually a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, mentioned by Imam al-Tabarani. I'm not quite sure what the grade of this hadith is or how authentic it is, but it is found in Imam al-Tabarani's works. Then he proceeds to intention or niyyah. So he says, وَالنِّيَّةِ فَأَعْزِمَ عَلَى امْتِثَالِ أَمْرِهِ تَعَالَى رجاء لثوابه وخوفا من عقابه وطلبا لتقربه وعظم في نفسك قدر مناجاته وانظر من تناجي وكيف تناجي وبماذا تناجي بحيث يليق أن يعرق جبينك من الخجل وترتعد فرائصك من الوجل ويصفر وجهك من خوف الزلل. So he says, as for intention, then make basically a firm intention that you are going to obey the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, hoping for his reward, fearing his punishment, seeking closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and make it a great matter in yourself. Give it great weight and importance, your act of calling upon him and beseeching him in the prayer. And all of this is something that we should do before we enter into the prayer. We need to pause and we reflect on what is it that we are about to do. And this is why Imam al-Khadimi then proceeds and says, so ask yourself basically, who am I going to beseech and call upon? And how will I do it? And with what am I going to do it? And it should be done, he says, in a way where essentially he's saying that there's a state that overcomes you, where your brow will sweat from the shame that you feel in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where your limbs will tremble from fear, where your face will go pale from the fear of slipping and erring in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, the whole idea is just take a moment to reflect on what it is you are about to do, for whom you are doing it, who are you standing in front of, what are you saying to that being who you are standing in front of. Who is he? What type of state should I enter into the prayer with? These are all sort of reflective aspects and qualities that a believer should have. And everything that we've discussed so far comes down to this core point. Do we have the ability to pause and reflect on what we are doing? This is really all that it comes down to. Can we, for a second, just stop and think about what is it that I am doing right now? And then proceed with the action that we are doing in the best way that we can. Then Imam al-Khadimi mentions a point about directing oneself to Allah with tawajjuh. And he says, اعلم أن قراءة دعائي إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين قل إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين لا شريك له وبذلك أمرت وأنا أول المسلمين. قبل التكبير حسن عند الإمام الأعظم ومحمد وأما عند أبي يوسف فيأتي بعد التكبير. So he says that know that the recitation of this dua, إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض, that I turn my face to the one who created the heavens and the earth, and I'm not from the mushrikeen. And also the verse, say, indeed my prayer and my worship and my life and my death, all of these belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or all of these are for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of the worlds, who has no partner. And this is what I have been commanded, and I am the first of the Muslimin, or I'm the first of those who have submitted. Reciting these before the takbir, before entering into prayer, is something that was deemed good by Imam Abu Hanifa and Muhammad, while Abu Yusuf actually considered it to be part of the thana, or part of what you recite after saying the initial takbir, after saying Allahu Akbar. And again, if you look at these verses, they again reflect this idea of turning one's entirety to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these ritual acts of worship. They return to this idea of making one's ibadah, making one's actions purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so these are things. Why is he saying it's hasan to recite them before the takbir? Again, to bring that presence of heart, to ready oneself to enter into the prayer. فإذا قلت إني وجهت وجهي فإذا أردت وجهك الظاهر فقد أثبتت لله تعالى جهة. So then he says, and if you say, indeed I am turning my face to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you intend by this your literal face, the bodily limb, then you have established a direction for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وإن أردت وجه قلبك وعنت أن الله تعالى ساهٍ وغافل فقد كذبت. And if you intend the turning of your heart to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while you are, heedless and forgetful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that state, then you've said a lie, you've lied. فأي شيء تطمع في صلاة أوله كذب. And so what is it that you expect from your prayer? What is it that you desire from your prayer that begins with a statement that is a lie? فَاصْرِفْ وَجْهَ قَلْبِكَ أَمَّا سِوَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. And so turn your heart away from everything except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This idea of kadhib is really interesting because we've taken it from some of the early salaf, and we'll discuss it in a second, inshallah. So he says, والتكبير, and then the takbir. فإذا نطق به لسانك فاجتهد أن لا يكذبك به قلبك. فإذا كان في قلبك شيء غيره تعالى فهو أكبر عندك من الله تعالى فالله يشهد إنك لكاذب. Right? And this is a serious matter. He says that the takbir, when you say Allahu Akbar, then when your tongue utters this particular statement, then you need to strive to ensure that your heart does not render it a false statement, does not render it a lie. It does not render what you are saying or expressing with your tongue to be something that is not true. Because if in your heart there is something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, at that moment, when you say Allahu Akbar, and there is something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your heart, then that other thing is actually greater with you than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because you've chosen to think about that thing than to think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Clearly that thing is more important to you than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so effectively what you're doing is, when you're saying Allahu Akbar at that moment, when your heart is completely disconnected from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is preoccupied with other thoughts, or attached to something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you are basically uttering a lie with your tongue. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will witness this. فإن كان هواك أغلب عليك من أمر الله تعالى فقد اتخذتها إلهك فقولك الله أكبر كلام مجرد وما أعظم هذا الخطر لولا الاستغفار وحسن الظن بكرمه تعالى وعفوه. And so he says, again he says, mentions the same thing that we just effectively mentioned, that if your desire and if your hawa preponderates over you rather than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you're basically taking your hawa as your Lord. And so your statement Allahu Akbar, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the greatest, which is an affirmation, it's a real affirmation the mu'min is making, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the greatest. In this moment in prayer, I'm going to begin this prayer by affirming the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And affirming this greatness within the salah means that I am basically shunning everything around me. I'm shunning the dunya. I'm shunning every aspect of the world to enter into the presence of my Lord. And the reason why I'm shunning it is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the greatest, and He is the one who deserves my worship. But when your mind is not present in that moment, then this statement is, like he says, kalamun mujarrad. It's basically it's just an expression. It's empty speech. It's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything if your heart is detached. And he says that this is a really grave matter. And if it were not for the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts our repentance and our seeking of forgiveness from Him, and our husn dhan, our good opinion of His generosity and His overlooking the errors and the faults of His servants, then this is all we have to hope in. But otherwise, when we are expressing this noble statement while our hearts are empty, then we are engaging in a lie. And we took in one of the previous classes, how one of the early Muslims, Shibli I believe, that one of his companions asked him, why is it that you change, your state changes, you go into this really overwhelmed state when you say the takbir in the salah? And he mentioned the same thing. He said, I'm afraid that I'm saying something that I'm uttering with my tongue, but my heart is deeming a lie. That I'm deeming myself a liar because I'm uttering something that I don't actually believe in. Because if I believed in this, then my heart would be present with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at that moment. And so the early Muslims saw every statement that they were making in the salah as something tremendous. And they feared that what they were expressing was simply an act of the tongue and not something that was actually present in their heart. And that's a type of almost a type of hypocrisy on their part. And so they had a great fear that that this is what they were engaged in. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to save us from that. And then finally he says, وَالْقِرَاءَةُ فَالنَّاسُ فِيهَا إِمَّا شَخْصٌ يَتَحَرَّكْ لِسَانَهُ وَقَلْبُهُ عَنْ لِسَانِهِ ظَاهِلٌ. So he says that, and basically over here again he's following Imam al-Ghazali, where he's saying the person who's reciting, there are three types of people. The first is someone who moves his tongue, but his heart is completely distracted and absent. فَحَالُهُ كَمَا عَرَفْتَ. So his state is basically, and you understand what this person's state is. He is min al-ghafilin, someone who is in a state of ghafla or heedlessness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَإِمَّا يُتْبِعُ لِسَانَهُ قَلْبَهُ فَيَفْهَمُ مِنْهُ كَأَنَّهُ سَمِعَهُ مِنْ غَيْرِهِ وَهَذِهِ دَرَجَةُ أَصْحَابِ الْيَمِينِ. So and then the second type of person is someone whose heart follows his tongue. And so essentially he recites with his tongue, and then his heart is made to understand and is steered towards a positive direction. And so it's as if the heart is being moved by an external force, right? It is as if there's an outsider reciting to the heart and then moving it in this direction of being aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is, he says, the level of the Ashab al-Yamin, those righteous people who will be given their book of deeds in their right hand in the next life. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from amongst those people. وإما يسبق قلبه إلى المعاني ويخدم لسانه قلبه فيكون لسانه ترجمان قلبه. And the third type of person he mentions is someone whose heart basically rushes forward or already moves towards grasping the meanings that will be recited. And the tongue basically assists in expressing what is in the heart. And so the tongue becomes the translator of what is in the heart, of the meanings that are found in the heart. وفرق بين أن يكون لسانه ترجمان قلبه وبين أن يكون معلم قلبه وهذه درجة المقربين. And so he says there's a difference between the tongue being a translator of what is found in the heart and between the tongue being something that instructs the heart and steers it in a particular direction. And so this last state is the state of the muqarrabin, those who are drawn close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The people at the level of high wilaya, people who are friends of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Gnostics. And so these are the three degrees of people who recite the Quran. One, merely recitation with the tongue, heart is heedless. The other, the heart initially, there's some level of heedlessness in it, but when they recite with the tongue, it's as if the heart picks up on that. The heart takes instruction from that and then moves towards this positive state. And then finally, those people whose hearts are already filled with these ma'ani, they already understand the meaning of what they are going to say. They understand what the prayer is. They understand what it means to have munajat with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the tongue becomes a way for them to express these states of their heart. And so these are the people at the highest station, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst them. But in the end, again, a lot of this is sort of self-evident. The deen is a struggle. The dunya is a realm in which the struggle takes place. It is not easy. We need to put in effort. And a lot of things, what you're finding with Imam al-Khadimi are, a lot of people will think and be like, okay, this is sort of obvious. We have to put in effort. We have to be more reflective. We have to think more deeply about things. We have to pause and bring to mind what we are doing in a particular moment, and so on and so forth. We need to be more self-vigilant about our actions on a day-to-day basis. Everyone sort of understands this, but it bears repeating because there are people who don't take this seriously, and they don't understand that yes, it is a struggle, but this is what is demanded of us in this worldly realm. And we try our best, we do what we can, and like we've mentioned in previous lessons, failure is simply part of the journey. And we are going to fail, we're going to drop to our knees and trip and fall many, 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 many times. And this is why we have this idea of istighfar and recognizing the karam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, recognizing that He is all merciful, recognizing that failure is a way to further ascend in His eyes if we turn back to Him properly. But a lot of the things that we're discussing right now, again, takes a bit of effort and resolve and recognition of what this world is, why we are here, where we are headed, and to whom we are headed. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us tawfiq. And inshallah, with that, we will conclude this session. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.